what happens when a magical quill, meant only for good, falls into the wrong hands? Could one tiny mistake change an entire forest into something unrecognizable? This is Serene from Serenity Haven, and today I will be narrating the story, The Stolen Quill. Spider turned the forest purple. Once upon a time, there was a magician that loved to make magical items. One day, a beautiful fairy came and asked him if he could take her favorite feather and turn it into a magical quill so she could write out her magical season-changing spells. He was so excited and agreed. He took the beautiful purple feather and cast a special spell just for the fairy. It sparkled and turned a brilliant blue light and then went back to its original state. He took a piece of paper and began to write. With a new quill in each line shone that same sparkly blue, then faded. It worked. The next day, the fairy returned to collect her new quill. The magician explained it was only for her to use, and should it fall into the wrong hands, it would be very bad. She understood and went home to begin her spell work. When she wasn't using the quill, she locked it in a special wooden box she had crafted for her. Months and seasons passed, and the quill served the fairy very well. All the fairies loved her spells, and they all were very helpful to them. One day in late summer, the fairy had finished her newest spell and forgot to put the quill away when she was done. She left and even forgot to lock her door. A sneaky spider snuck into the fairy's home and saw the purple feather. She loved purple things and just had to have the feather, so she took it and left. When the fairy arrived home, she was so tired, she went to bed. The spider simply loved her new purple feather. She spent hours playing and admiring it. She then, sitting high on her web, dropped the feather, and it splashed a small spot of ink onto the floor. It shimmered blue and sparkled. The now intrigued spider tried to write something with it. "Purple door," she wrote, and her door turned purple. Whoa! She wrote something else. "Purple house," and her little stump house turned purple too. The spider went out and was so excited. She started turning everything she came across purple. Trees, plants, even a passing innocent squirrel was now turned purple to the spider's delight. The next day, the fairy went to go write a new fall spell to turn all the leaves beautiful fall colors. But when she opened her quill box, the quill was gone. She began frantically looking for it, but with no luck. She started asking the other fairies if they had seen it, but they were too busy trying to figure out why everything in the forest was turning purple. She went to ask the magician for help. He too was very busy trying to figure out the purple problem and how to help fix it. The spider had turned everything in her house purple, and all her neighborhood. She looked around and wondered what else she could do with this lovely quill. The fairies were asking everyone if they knew anything. The poor purple squirrel came forward and told them he had been just working in his garden when Mrs. Spider came by and said hi, and suddenly he was purple. He was so confused and could not wash it out. The fairies told him to go to the magician for help, and they would go and see Mrs. Spider. The closer the fairies got to Mr. Spider's house, they noticed there was more and more purple. They looked at each other, growing increasingly more confused. Maybe Mr. Squirrel wasn't the only creature purple? Was there something in the water? Did one of the fairy's spells not work properly? What was going on? The fairy was on her own quest to find her quill. She traveled and looked every place she had been. She had gone through every book and cranny in her home and had noticed a small web in the corner. She knew she was very tidy, so where did this come from? Maybe Mr. Spider had snuck into her home? She decided to go ask her and see if she'd been there. It seemed everyone was looking for Mr. Spider now. Where was she? What was she doing? The hunt was on. The sneaky Mr. Spider was off, still turning all things around her purple as fast as her little legs would carry her. Purple rocks, purple trees, purple water in the stream. How fun this was. So much beautiful purple things everywhere. More, more. The world must be purple. All shades of this amazing color. The fairy met up with the others, and they all discussed what they were thinking. They asked the fairy if she started this, or if one of her spells backfired. She told them no, she had been very specific and very careful when writing them, that nothing could go wrong. They asked if maybe there was something infecting the land and creatures through the rain or water. She said no. The purple is something unique, and she wasn't aware of anything in the world that could turn things purple the way this was. They told her Mr. Squirrel had mentioned seeing Mr. Spider go by, and then he was suddenly purple, and he couldn't wash it off. The fairy mentioned finding a small web in her house, and her magical quill she used to write her spells was missing, and she was coming to ask Mrs. Spider if she had come to her house. They all decided to split up and look for Mrs. Spider, and all meet at the great tree in about an hour or so to see if they had found her, and they could all talk to her together. Mrs. Spider was tired. She had made it from her little stump house all the way to the middle of the forest, and now needed a nap. She made herself a giant purple web and curled up with the magical quill and fell asleep. The fairy and a few others decided to follow the trail of purple. It wound around mountains and over hills, up through trees, and through stumps and around mushrooms, and then deep into the forest. Such an interesting route. They turned the corner and were met with a giant purple web. Mrs. Spider was happily nestled in the center, fast asleep. The fairy walked up and gently woke her up. Mrs. Spider stretched and saw the fairies. She got worried and tried to get away, but the fairies in the group surrounded her. The fairy gently spoke to Mrs. Spider and said she wasn't mad. She just wanted her to come with her, and the fairies just wanted to speak to her at the great tree. Mrs. Spider agreed to go with them. In a different part of the grove, some of the fairies decided to go get the magician and Mr. Squirrel and bring to the great tree as well. Once everyone had got to the great tree, the fairy walked up with Mrs. Spider, not in an accusing way, but to support her. She asked her if she had been to the fairy's home. Mrs. Spider lowered her head, ashamed, and nodded and produced the magical quill in front of her to the fairy, telling her yes, she had been there and saw this amazing purple feather. And she loved purple so much, she took it without asking. The fairy took it gently and told Mrs. Spider she totally understood why she felt the want to take it, and that it was her favorite purple feather as well. She explained it was a gift from a magical bird. she had met many moons ago for helping him. Mrs. Spider felt so bad for taking it without permission after hearing it was a gift. She would hate it if someone took one of her favorite gifts. She apologized to the fairy and explained she felt so bad. She promised to ask before taking things from now on and not go into people's places without asking first. The fairy accepted her apology and agreed those were very good steps to take in the future. Next, Mr. Squirrel came up and spoke to Mrs. Spider. He explained how her excitement and not paying attention caused him to turn purple, and that he couldn't wash it out of his poor fur. Mrs. Spider felt so guilty and apologized to him. Just then, the magician came forward and told them both it was luckily able to be reversed and not to feel too bad. Mrs. Spider told them it was a terrible accident. She had been so excited that everything was turning purple she didn't know. Poor Mr. Squirrel got caught in the mix. Mr. Squirrel understood, and seeing how sorry Mrs. Spider was, gave her a hug and told her not to worry. Everything would be okay, just to make sure in the future, maybe to be aware of her surroundings. She agreed she would try to. The magician stepped forward next. He explained to Mrs. Spider stealing was wrong, and to make sure to ask from now on because that was a very powerful spell, and the magic was specifically tailored to the fairy, to do her specially spells. She hung her head sadly and nodded, understanding he was right. He told her he could fix it, but he would need a lot of help from the fairies. Feeling sorry and hoping she could change her ways, she asked everyone in the room if she would be allowed to help fix the damage she caused. She promised to work on herself and do better from now on. Everyone agreed to accept Mrs. Spider's help and offered to help her if she needed help to change. She thanked them so very much. From that day forward, Mrs. Spider was a huge help to the fairies. Mr. Squirrel and Mrs. Spider decided on weekly dinners together and are now the best friends. Mr. Squirrel even decided to keep some of the purple on the tip of his tail and thinks it looks pretty neat. He says the color just grew on him. The fairy has asked the magical bird for another purple feather and gifted it to Mrs. Spider, and she was so grateful. The fairy makes sure she is never rushed to do her spells anymore, and makes sure her quill is always put away properly.